Good afternoon, everyone. I would like to welcome all of you on behalf of the Alliance for Retired Americans. We're the organization that sponsored this today. We represent seniors, and that's why it's at 1 o'clock in the afternoon, because I couldn't get y'all to come out at night, right? So first of all, I'd like to explain to you that what we do what ARP does, but we don't sell insurance. And our one employee, we have one employee in the state, and he was looking forward to coming today until he heard from National, no, you're not going up there. You're coming down to D.C. to lobby for Social Security. So that's where he is today. So we all work a lot of days in order to address your needs. We have a senior group that meets in the spring and in the fall. They're going to be meeting at the Mill Creek Community Building on the 26th, and this topic will be the Medicaid expansion that the governor has now agreed to. And the presenter will be Erin Gill Nienhauser. Her husband's here today. He checked you all in. Erin had to be at a conference today, or she would have been here. But she is coming next week. She works for Pennsylvania Health Access Network, and she's one of the best presenters you could ever hope for. So that's why we have a couple of legislators are sending their staff to our senior group meeting, because they know they're going to get the best explanation they could get. And that's at the Mill Creek County Building at noon on the 26th. Okay? I also would like to mention that Dave, Erin's husband, and Erin are going to be in this movie that was put on by a group of people. It's called The Brainwashing of My Dad. It's going to be coming out next spring, and that's a great opportunity. That's financed by donations that are made to on the computer, on the net. Okay, so those are the things that I wanted to tell you about. Now it's my pleasure to introduce you to one of the most fascinating speakers I'm sure you've ever heard. You are really in for a thrill. I'd like to introduce to you Rachel Tabachnick, and she has studied the right for 10 years with the, what's the name of the think tank? Political Research Associates. So with no further ado, let me present Rachel to you. Thank you.
Thanks for having me. I'm so excited to be here in Erie. I'm from Pittsburgh, and made the trip up and enjoyed meeting people here in Erie last night. I've got a lot of material for you, so let's get going. First, let me just say a lot will be passing in front of you. Don't try to take notes. This will be available as a YouTube on the internet. And also at the end, I will put up an email address that you can reach me if you have questions. Because as I talk, I'm going to be showing you a lot of web pages and things like that. It's far too much to read. It's just to show you what these pages look like, what kind of information is there. As Judy said, I've actually been researching the infrastructure of the right, both the political right and the religious right, now for well over 10 years, and I'm currently a fellow with Political Research Associates in Boston. So with no more ado, let's talk about ALEC and SPN. That stands for the American Legislative Exchange Council and State Policy Network. How many of you have heard of ALEC? Okay, so we've got a few. Okay, so why do we need to talk about these obscure things that you might not have ever heard of? We talk a lot about dollars in politics. But you know, when we talk about that, usually we're talking about campaigns. So we're talking very specifically about money put in campaigns to get certain people elected. And more often than not, we're talking about the national level. I want us to think about this in a different way today. I want us to think about dollars spent to impact policy. Not just elections, not just who gets elected, but ongoing infrastructure that's there 365 days a year, not just when we elect a president or when we elect members of Congress. And I want us to think about it in terms of state and local impact, not just federal. Let's start with ALEC. What is ALEC? ALEC is an organization that's been around for a long time. It's not new, although people have just begun to talk about it in the last few years. It's the American Legislative Exchange Council. What it is an organization which is primarily corporations, business-funded, that bring together several times a year state legislators from all over the country, and they put together model bills. And then those are the bills, many of the bills, that are introduced at our state house and at other state houses. I like this poster here. What does ALEC do? ALEC brought you stand your ground, lower wages, underfunded schools. You can go online in several different places, and I'm going to give you a couple of places here, and see how ALEC works. Like I said, just a few years ago, all of a sudden ALEC was conversation when an organization was able to uncover 800 of these model bills and documents and put them online. Let's go back to this. Let me go here, okay. That website is something called ALEC Exposed. So if you go to ALEC Exposed, you can see those 800 model bills and documents. You can see all the categories that ALEC covers, trying to impact their labor, trying to reduce the power of the regulatory system, trying to reduce taxation on corporations, trying to privatize anything and everything that can possibly be privatized, schools, prisons, and so forth. So if you go to ALEC Exposed, you can see a lot of that information. I'm going to back up a minute because I want to show you this screen. This is a journal from the National Committee for Responsive Philanthropy in 1991. Think of how long ago that was. In 1991, this journal was writing about ALEC, and at that point in time said ALEC already had 2,400 state legislators participating from 50 states, representing 1/3 of the state legislators. So what that means is they hold these conferences several times a year in nice hotels. They pay for the legislators to come. They meet, and they help them write the model bills. And some of these model bills have showed up in state houses with the blank, put the name of your state here. And so that helps to understand how do we get these radical bills that come to our state houses all at one time. That helps to explain how that happens. And it's been going on for many years. And again, ALEC Exposed helped bring that out into the sunlight and has gotten the organization a lot of bad press. So if you go to ALEC Exposed, you can actually see some of these model bills. You can see to their best estimate which state legislators still belong and still are participating in these conferences. You can go online and see report cards that they do on education. Not report cards on the quality of education necessarily, but report cards on how far along their agenda for privatization of education has come. Keystone Progress, which is a nonprofit organization in Pennsylvania, did a big report on ALEC in 2011, which you can also access online, that documents how ALEC has worked specifically in Pennsylvania. And recently, ALEC is now working to go to the county and city level. So not just impacting state legislators and the bills going to our state house, but now impacting policy at the city and county level. So now let's move on to the State Policy Network. I borrowed this graphic from the people who do ALEC Exposed, the Center for Media and Democracy, because I think that is an excellent depiction of how the State Policy Network has covered the country. The State Policy Network has been around since 1992. Also, not a new creation by any means. But now, before we go into the details about this, we need to back up and look at the history behind the infrastructure that exists in this country. This is a picture of FDR signing the National Labor Relations Act. I'm sure you recognize. Some of you may have been following the series that's on television right now about the Roosevelts, which very visually puts us back in a time, particularly in the beginning of that series, before we had the kind of labor and regulatory structure that we have now. The purpose of these networks of conservative think tanks is to go back to a time before FDR, and as one speaker said at the Heritage Foundation this spring, going back to a time before Teddy Roosevelt, before we had labor and regulatory structures that limited hours, that provided a minimum wage, that provide safety regulation for workers. If you want to read about this war on the New Deal and the war on the Progressive Era, from the New Deal era to about 1980, this is an excellent book, Invisible Hands. And in this book, the author, Kim Phillips Fine, talks about the relationship between businesses, corporations, and also with the religious right. Now, this book stops at 1980, but it's excellent reading if you're interested in this topic. But I'm going to now take us forward into what happened, let's say starting about 1970s up into the present. What started to happen is that corporations and major money in the country began to fund a network of national think tanks. We're going to come in a minute to the State Policy Network, which is the state-level ones. But at the national level, these included the American Enterprise Institute, Heritage Foundation. Have you heard of Heritage Foundation? Yes, and the kind of activities they do. Cato Institute, Manhattan Institute, and so forth. And these were what they call free market think tanks working to roll back the New Deal, essentially. This is an article from Commonwealth Institute written in 1999. At that time, now quite a few years ago, they were talking about the fact that $1 billion, now this is in 1990s money, $1 billion had been put into funding this network of think tanks. And the funding came largely from family foundations like the Scaife Foundations, which are based in Pittsburgh, the Olin Foundation, Bradley Foundation, Smith-Richardson Foundation, the Koch brothers foundations. Have you heard of the Koch brothers? Coors, DeVos, Templeton, and large family foundations which have spent hundreds of millions of dollars funding these networks of free market think tanks. So you can go to the websites of these big think tanks, like the Heritage Foundation, and it's no secret. You can follow online their agendas to take out labor, to take out the regulatory system. This is from the Cato Institute, American Enterprise Institute. And the think tank that I'm with did a study a few years ago looking at what they call the anti-labor arsenal. And you can still see this online. What they found in this, they've tracked money to 21 of these think tanks, tracked in the time period they were looking at $170 million, $50 million coming from the Bradley Foundation alone, and then $41 million from the Sarah Scaife Foundation in Pittsburgh alone. One of the other big targets of these free market think tanks is public education. And I want to read this from Milton Friedman on the Cato Institute website. Vouchers are not an end in themselves. They are means to make a transition from a government to a free market system. So one of the major targets is to gradually privatize public education, using school vouchers, money that would come from the public system, to fund private schools as a way to make that transition to the privatization of public education. You've probably also been following some of the things that have been happening, particularly to public sector unions in places like Wisconsin. You might recognize some of these pictures from a couple of years ago. That didn't just happen out of the blue when Scott Walker was elected. The groundwork for that had been laid for a very long time. And you can go back and look at these think tanks and see the process. Now let's look for a minute. This is an article that ran in a number of papers in 2010. 15 mind-blowing facts about wealth and inequality in America. And this article started off, the poor are getting poorer, wages are falling behind inflation, and social mobility is at an all-time low. Real average earnings have not increased in 50 years. Well, these free market think tanks look at this information and they see an opportunity different than what we might see. What they saw is an opportunity to take out public sector unions by pitting public sector workers against private sector workers, many of which have stagnant wages, have already lost pensions and benefits. So we can go and look, this happens to be Cato Institute, and see the studies and articles that they had been cranking out for several years. We can go to Manhattan Institute and see the arguments against having collective bargaining in the public sector. And then we see how these articles made their way out into media in the country. This is from the Orange County Register. And this is the cover of Reason magazine in 2010, showing that supposedly the monsters are public servants who will become your masters, who are destroying the economy. Now, I sometimes give entire presentations on how this anti-labor, anti-regulatory, anti-Social Security message makes it from the money source and then marches into people's homes. But for today, I just wanted to give you this small sampling of the fact that this does not just happen because somebody's elected on a certain day. The groundwork, the narrative is laid, is disseminated in the press, radio, Rush Limbaugh, etc., before the trap is sprung. So now that brings us back to the state policy network. So we see for several decades, billions of dollars was put into building this infrastructure of what they call free market think tanks. State Policy Network is an organization that ties together think tanks in each state. So the Heritage Foundation, a big national think tank, is in Washington, D.C., but there are, in essence, little mini heritage foundations in every single state in the country now. And just like ALEC brings together state legislators from the state houses all over the country to write their model bills, the State Policy Network serves as an umbrella to link these think tanks in all 50 states. This is also no secret. People don't talk about it much. For some reason, it doesn't make the news, hardly at all, even in progressive politics. But you can go right to their website, and you can also see their privatization agenda. It was formed in 1992 by a man named Thomas Rowe, who did it as a part of expanding Reagan federalism. Again, this is nothing new. I'm going back now to this 1991 journal that I showed you before, where it's talking about how these state think tanks are being brought together and organized. A colleague of mine at PRA wrote an article about this in 1999, explaining how it worked and how these think tanks were impacting policy. But unlike ALEC, which has sort of hit the news now for several years, the State Policy Network is still pretty much invisible in the press and not talked about. My colleague Fred Clarkson wrote here, the stated purpose of the network was to take the Reagan Revolution to the states. The think tanks would provide resources for state-level activists, offer leadership training that would strengthen state-level Republican parties, and over time would reinvigorate the right's national-level leadership. And again, he wrote that in 1999. He more recently updated this article to reflect what is happening today. So you can go online and you can see the directory of the State Policy Network. You can pull up what the State Policy Network is in your state. So if we go to the page on Pennsylvania, we can see that our State Policy Network members something called the Commonwealth Foundation in Harrisburg. How many have heard of the Commonwealth Foundation? It's quoted in our papers and our media all over the state all the time as if it was just an objective think tank working in your best interest. And you can go online and see other states, Wisconsin, Michigan, and so forth. So what happens with these think tanks is there are various sizes. Some of them are very large, very well-funded. Others are small. But they all share their information, just like with ALEC. So all the research, all the talking points is all shared. So no matter how small or lightly funded your state think tank is, you have access to the work done in all 50 states. This is the head of the Commonwealth Foundation here, Matthew Briette, who came from the one in Michigan. He had been head of the education sector, the one in Michigan, for many years, and then was brought here. And we have seen a real uptick in the efforts to privatize our schools in the process. Now, our state policy network member, the Commonwealth Foundation, was part of something called the Pennsylvania Plan. And in 1989, Don Eberly, the founder, gave a speech to the Heritage Foundation about how ideas from the Heritage Foundation had helped to birth the think tank here in our state. So in the speech, Eberly says, "We have organized a leadership team that is implementing a multifaceted organizational building plan called the Pennsylvania Plan, which consists of many of the same entities that have been used effectively in Washington. These entities include the Commonwealth Foundation, which is the Heritage Foundation equivalent, now 2 years old." And you can go right online and see the history of this and the funding. It was largely funded by Richard Mellon Scaife, who passed away just a few months ago. And again, what you see with these think tanks, not only here in Pennsylvania, but all over the country, is that they are treated in press, often treated in press, as if they are completely objective sources of research material in your best interest. One of the interesting things that's happened in recent years is that they've formed publicity arms. So in this state, we have the Pennsylvania Independent, which was part of the Commonwealth Foundation. It's now supposedly independent from the Commonwealth Foundation, but which is quoted in press all over the state as if it was an independent source. Back to our State Policy Network member, the Commonwealth Foundation. I want to give you an idea. I was talking about how it's projected, it's out there in the press as this very objective, good government type source, but I want to show you what types of projects they've been involved in recently. And last year they sent out a fundraising letter in 2013, March of 2013, about their Project Goliath. Now, what is Project Goliath? It had a cover letter featuring our Senator Pat Toomey introducing the letter, and then the letter went out to Commonwealth Foundation members and funders asking for money. And it happened to be covered by Li Feng in The Nation is how this got out. Somebody got a copy of this letter and it got out, and you can also access this online now. But the idea of Project Goliath is to slay the Goliath, like the Goliath was slain in Wisconsin of the public sector unions, and particularly in this state, they want to take out teachers' unions. So Project Goliath, conquering Pennsylvania's political giant. Like biblical David, your gift will help us hurl the stones that finally take down freedom's #1 enemy in our state. That enemy is none other than the government union bosses. This is a real fundraising letter that went out all over the state. It said in Wisconsin, well, let me move down and say the Wisconsin miracle did not happen overnight. Instead, it came as a direct result of 15 years of hard, coordinated work by full-time freedom fighters and far-sighted funders. And yet we don't even talk about this. You know, like, again, we talk about the money that's in campaigns, we talk about how that helps particular people get elected, but we don't talk about this 365-day-a-year effort to indoctrinate the public that's going on, that receives equal or perhaps even greater funding than what we see poured into the electoral process. Let's move on with this letter. Our massive strategic victory to expand school choice last summer is only the most recent and significant example of our onslaught of blows against Goliath. Did you know that there was a massive expansion of privatization programs in this state over the last year? So these are things that we're not talking about as they happen. And it continues. Well, we lost a little time there, so let's keep going. Now, going back again to this 1991 journal. And this journal very accurately predicts not only the agenda, the desired outcome, but also the process through which this would take place in the states, including extensive information about Eberly, the founder of the Commonwealth Foundation, and the process in Pennsylvania. And again, this was 1991. And yet it happens almost out of sight of Pennsylvanians. In that 1991 journal, they explained teachers' unions, and now they're talking about Commonwealth Foundation and these other state policy network members. Teacher unions are seen as a selfish and powerful enemy whose goal is to protect the bureaucracy and stifle progress in education. The thrust is aimed at breaking the public education monopoly, primarily through vouchers and tuition tax credits. And tuition tax credits is what they were talking about in that Project Goliath letter that was greatly expanded, what some people refer to as backdoor vouchers. And we are the second largest state in the country after Florida with these tuition tax credits, which is essentially giving a corporation credit against their state taxes. So this is money that does not go into the state coffers, money that essentially is coming out of our pocket. And then that money is spent to fund scholarships to private schools, some of which are teaching religious bigotry, creationism, all kinds of things, because there is no oversight or regulation about what they teach. Now, if we go back to Don Eberly's speech at the Heritage Foundation in 1989, I want to throw in another factor into how this has been so successful, not only in Pennsylvania, but also in states across the nation. In that speech, going to the red letters, Eberly says, after over a year of development work, we have just brought online the Pennsylvania Family Institute, which might be compared to the Family Research Council here in Washington. Now, what he's talking about there are the family policy councils. Thus far, we've been talking about a network of national free market think tanks and state free market think tanks. What he's talking about here is a corresponding network of think tanks, of which there are about 36 states that have these now, that are called family policy councils. Now, when we think of what we call the religious right and these family policy councils, Family Research Council, focus on family, and the state entities, we normally think of social conservative issues. But the reality is that they are also very involved in partnering with the free market think tanks on things like the privatization of Social Security and the privatization of public education. Again, you can go online and you can see maps showing the state affiliates of Family Research Council, including ours, which is PAFamily at pafamily.org. And they produce a voter's guide, which this particular copy you see here was inside of my voter location last time I voted. And they also do things, this is Tony Perkins, who is the head of Family Research Council. This is an event in 2009 held with a group of members of the US Congress and Senate and prayer leaders praying to defeat the Affordable Care Act, or as it's often called, Obamacare. So the point I'm trying to make here is this is not just about the hot button social conservative issues of abortion and gay rights. These are partners with the free market think tanks. Again, let me go back and mention the privatization of schools is taking place here. Not far from here, from where we are sitting, there are schools receiving these corporate tax scholarship dollars, which use textbooks like these, which teach creationism, global warming denial, bigotry against other religions, other denominations, and so forth. To give you an example of how the religious message and the free market message come together in a merger, I want to give you a specific example. In 2010, there was a 6-DVD set of training materials that was developed and used in churches and ministries all around the country. And literally sessions would be held. They were like 12 half-hour sessions. You would use the DVDs, training people in anti-environmental mentality and global warming denial. The head of this process was a man named Calvin Beisner, who's affiliated with several free market think tanks that are funded by the sources that I showed you previously. And I want to show you just a trailer of this so you get the idea of what happens when you bring together this anti-regulatory mentality and merge it with what I think is a perversion of religion.
In what has become one of the greatest deceptions of our day, radical environmentalism is striving to put America and the world under its destructive control. This so-called green dragon is seducing your children in our classrooms and popular culture. Its lust for political power now extends to the highest global levels. And its twisted view of the world elevates nature above the needs of people, of even the poorest and the most helpless. With millions falling prey to its spiritual deception, the time is now to stand and resist. Around the world, environmentalism has become a radical movement, something we call the Green Dragon, and it is deadly. Deadly to human prosperity, deadly to human life, deadly to human freedom, and deadly to the gospel of Jesus Christ. Make no mistake about it, environmentalism is no longer your friend. It is your enemy. And the battle is not primarily political or material, it is spiritual.
As a former pastor, I'm always on the alert to threats to the Christian faith. And make no mistake about it, environmentalism is exactly that. It is its own religion.
The environmental movement has actually become what I call the cult of the Green Dragon. And we need to be prepared as Christians to rescue people from that cult.
Increasingly, I believe Bible-believing Christians are becoming aware and, as a result, more concerned about the underlying philosophy of the radical environmental agenda and how it's pointing people away from God and into humanism.
Environmentalists have a long history of believing and promoting exaggerations and myths.
Environmental science simply does not have a good track record, not at all. Their false assertions are based more on their own morbid, pessimistic fears, not on any good science.
I'm going to move on from there, but you get the idea. Now, among those people we saw, Tony Perkins, head of the Family Research Council. So get an idea of what happens when big anti-regulatory money comes together with a version of religion. Now, keep in mind, all of what you just saw is aside from campaigns, from electoral campaigns and campaign funding. This is an ongoing process of winning hearts and minds to their way of thinking, to their worldview. Again, this merging of a laissez-faire, unfettered, unregulated market with religion is not new. This is Gary North's Biblical Economics Today journal from 1995. And he has a very unpleasant view of labor unions. I won't go into details now for time's sake, but on Gary North's website, you can see that he says the Bible mandates free market capitalism. The Bible is anti-socialist. Another one of the people who was in that film, David Barton, I have video of him, not time to show you today, but I have video of him talking about that Jesus was against the minimum wage. Did you know that? Now, let's go back here for a second. Gary North. Gary North is not some obscure individual, even if you haven't heard of him. Right at the moment, Gary North is the director of Ron Paul's new homeschooling program. He was one of Ron Paul's original staffers, has worked with him for years, and that is a place where you see this merger of sort of this anti-regulatory worldview mixing with religion. Again, I would emphasize this invisible hands that takes you up to about 1980 in this saga of how this partnership came to be. But I want to point out something here just at the very end before we open up for questions. After billions of dollars and years, decades of indoctrination, you can't always control what you create. This is a picture my husband and I took. I think I was driving. I think he took the picture, okay? As we were driving along in South Carolina, and there had been a Tea Party event. And this was a van pulling a car that had Tea Party slogans written all over it. And if we get up close on the back, we see, in 1892, the Supreme Court declared America a Christian nation. So the Tea Party movement was very much a merger of what we're talking about here, although it wasn't often not described that way in the press, a merger of this laissez-faire market mentality with a type of Christian nationalism. So we started talking about big money in politics. And of course, one of the most famous name probably out there right now is the Koch brothers, who are tied for the fourth richest people in the nation. And I'm sure you've probably heard a bit about the Koch brothers and their funding of politics. I want to take you back sort of full circle. We're talking about when you put all this money in, sometimes you can't control what you create. How many of you remember the John Birch Society? I thought so. Fred Koch was one of the founding, Fred Koch, the father, the deceased father of the Koch brothers, was one of the founding board members of the John Birch Society. And he wrote this little pamphlet in 1963, A Businessman Looks at Communism. And to give you an idea, in his mind, everything that he didn't like was communist, okay? So he said, labor unions have long been a communist goal. The effort is frequently made to have the worker do as little as possible for the money he receives, This practice alone can destroy the country. And then he said, you may be sure the communists are fishing furiously in the troubled waters of integration on both sides. This pamphlet becomes quite openly racist, as were the ads that the John Birch Society, half-page, full-page newspaper ads fighting the civil rights movement, calling it communist. And this was, again, tied together with their free market, anti-regulatory worldview. And on page 25, he says, the colored man looms large in the communist plan to take over America. Now, that's the father of the Koch brothers in 1963. What was he so afraid of? I want to read another quote to you from this is Fred Koch being celebrated in the pages of the current John Birch Society magazine in 2010 and celebrating that pamphlet that I just read to you from. And the John Birch Society has made quite a significant comeback through the Tea Party movement. And again, I wanted to think about, what happens when you pour all this money into a worldview? You don't necessarily control where all that worldview goes. I want to read you another quote. I'm going to close with this from 1961 and then open it up for questions. That's the John Birch Society talking about. Let's move on to this quote. We must guard against being fooled by false slogans such as right to work. It is a law to rob us of our civil rights and job rights. Its purpose is to destroy labor unions and the freedom of collective bargaining by which unions have improved wages and working conditions of everyone. Wherever these laws have been passed, wages are lower, job opportunities are fewer, and there are no civil rights. We do not intend to let them do this to us. We demand this fraud be stopped. Our weapon is our vote. And this is what I think Fred Koch was so afraid of. This is Martin Luther King Jr. speaking in 1961. With that, I would like to close. There is an email address that you can reach me at if you have questions. You can also see some of this material at Political Research Associates, which is www.politicalresearch.org. Like I said, the video, I guess including our little technical glitch there, will be up online, so you can go back and look at some of these websites and look at this material. But at this time, I would like to open this up to any questions that you have about ALEC, State Policy Network, or any of the associated things that I brought up.